I didn't think much about the house when we first saw it. My wife and I had been house hunting for months, and we were both exhausted from the process. It was one of those properties you almost pass over, a modest 2-story on a quiet cul-de-sac. Nothing flashy, just fine. The kind of place you convince yourself will feel right once you make it your own. The photos online were unremarkable. Wooden floors, a decent kitchen, lots of light. We bought the house in a heartbeat and moved in a few weeks later. I was in the basement unpacking boxes when I saw it. A small door, maybe 4 feet high, flush against the far wall. It was painted the same dull gray as the concrete, nearly invisible unless you were really looking. It didn't have a handle, just a faint seam running around the edges, like it was designed to blend into the wall. At first, I thought it was one of those utility panels for pipes or wiring, but something about it struck me as off. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. The kind of stare where you're trying to make sense of what you're looking at, but can't quite put your finger on why it feels wrong. I called out to my wife, who was upstairs setting up the kitchen, but she didn't answer. Maybe she didn't hear me. Maybe she ignored me. She hated the basement, said it gave her the creeps. Normally I would have left something like that alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight from the pile of tools and tried to open the door. At first it wouldn't budge, but when I wedged the edge of a crowbar into the seam, it popped open with a hiss, like the air behind it had been sealed in for years. The smell hit me first, damp earth, mixed with something sharp and metallic, like rusted iron. I expected to see pipes or maybe a storage space, but instead there was a narrow tunnel, pitch black, leading into the earth. The walls were rough and uneven, almost like they'd been dug out by hand. I shined the flashlight down the tunnel, but the light just seemed to dissolve into the darkness. I should have closed it right then and there, but something about it pulled me in. I stepped closer, crouching slightly to fit through the small opening, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The deeper I leaned in, the colder it felt, and the smell grew stronger, making my stomach churn. I called out again, "Hey, did you know about this?" My voice echoed faintly down the tunnel, but no reply came, just silence. My wife's silence from upstairs, the tunnel's silence below, it all felt too quiet. Like the air was holding its breath. I leaned in just a little further and noticed something strange on the walls. Scratches, long uneven marks etched into the dirt, some overlapping like whatever made them had been frantic. My heart started to pound. I stepped back quickly, slamming the door shut with more force than I meant to. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing hard, staring at the door as if it might open again on its own. I told myself it was just some leftover part of the house's weird design. A crawl space maybe, old storage. But the scratches stayed in my mind. And the smell. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't tell my wife. I didn't want to freak her out, and I wasn't even sure what I'd found. I didn't want to move into the house. My wife loved it though, and after months of dead-end listings and offers falling through, I caved. It wasn't a bad house, 2 stories, a big yard, a cozy little porch, but something about it didn't sit right with me, even from the first walkthrough. Maybe it was the way the previous owner had left in a rush, leaving random things behind. A rusted toolbox in the garage, a pair of mismatched shoes under the stairs. Maybe it was the weird layout, with doors that didn't seem to lead anywhere logical, and a staircase that creaked even when no one was on it. But I didn't say anything. It was affordable, it was in a good neighborhood, and we were tired of searching. So we moved in. The first couple of weeks were normal enough. We unpacked, settled in, and started making it our own. My wife spent her days painting rooms and rearranging furniture while I tackled the less glamorous stuff, fixing a leaky faucet, reattaching a loose hinge on the pantry door. It wasn't until I started cleaning out the garage that things got strange. The garage was a mess. The last owner had left piles of junk, boxes of old magazines, tangled extension cords, half-empty cans of paint. It was all packed into one corner like someone had shoved it there in a hurry. As I worked my way through the clutter, I noticed a hatch in the floor, hidden under a layer of dusty tarp. It was square, metal, and bolted shut with an industrial-looking lock. I stared at it for a moment, trying to figure out why anyone would need a hatch in their garage. A storm shelter, maybe? But the house didn't come with one, or at least the listing hadn't mentioned it. I called my wife over. "Did you know about this?" She shook her head, looking as confused as I felt. We tried to ignore it at first. It wasn't like we had a key for it. But over the next few days, it started to bother me. Every time I went into the garage, my eyes went straight to that hatch. I couldn't stop thinking about what might be inside. Old tools? A root cellar? Something worse? One evening I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my toolbox and with a little effort, managed to break the lock. The hatch creaked open, revealing a ladder that led straight down into darkness. A cold, damp smell wafted up and I hesitated, gripping the edges of the hatch. My wife was watching from the doorway. "You really want to go down there?" she asked, her voice uneasy. I didn't answer. I just grabbed a flashlight and started climbing down. The ladder went deeper than I expected, the air getting colder with each step. When my feet hit the ground, I swung the flashlight around and froze. The room was small and concrete, like a bunker, but it was filled with shelves. Each shelf was crammed with jars, hundreds of them, lined up in neat, perfect rows. I walked closer, my breath fogging in the chill. The jars were filled with liquid, cloudy and yellowish, and floating inside were things. At first, I thought they were animals, small, misshapen lumps, some with what looked like limbs or tails. But the more I looked, the less sure I was. They didn't look like anything I recognized. I felt a wave of nausea and turned to leave when I noticed something else. A table in the corner, covered in papers. They were old, yellowed with age, and covered in scribbled handwriting and crude diagrams. I picked one up. It was a sketch of a jar with notes scrawled in the margins, measurements, observations. A word repeated over and over, preservation. I didn't stay to read more. I scrambled up the ladder, slamming the hatch shut behind me. My wife stood there wide-eyed, asking me what I found, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. I just told her it was empty. When we first toured the house, I didn't think much about the stains. They were faint, scattered across the wooden floors in a random pattern, the kind of thing you expect in an older home. The real estate agent brushed them off with a cheerful laugh. "Previous owners must have had a dog," she said. My wife nodded, and that was the end of it. The rest of the house was perfect. 3 bedrooms, big windows, a huge backyard. We didn't ask any more questions. Moving day came, and the house felt alive with possibility. My wife was already talking about paint colors, and I was imagining barbecues in the backyard. The stains came up again when I was carrying the couch into the living room. Up close, they didn't look like pet accidents anymore. They had this uneven, splattered look to them, and no matter how much we scrubbed, they wouldn't come out. "It gives the place character," my wife joked, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. A week later, we found the first thing. It was in the closet of the smallest bedroom, a little envelope tucked between the floorboards. My wife thought it was some leftover mail, but when we opened it, it wasn't. Inside was a photograph, black and white, of a woman sitting at a dining table. Her face was slightly blurry, and something about the angle of her posture made me uncomfortable, like she wasn't posing. She looked caught, unaware. There was no writing on the back, no date, nothing. We both laughed nervously and decided it was probably junk left behind by the previous owners. Things kept popping up, though. A cracked piece of ceramic tile buried in the garden. It was pale blue, like the ones in our bathroom, but the edges were jagged, sharp enough to cut. Then there was the locked drawer in the kitchen. I only found it because the cabinets didn't shut properly, and one day I yanked too hard. The whole thing came off the hinges, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment underneath. Inside was a single key, rusted and bent, with a scrap of red thread tied around it. It didn't fit any of the doors in the house. At first, it felt like a game, like we were unraveling the story of whoever lived here before us. But the more we found, the less it felt like a story I wanted to know. The big crack in the drywall by the stairs didn't look accidental anymore. It was too jagged, too wide, like something heavy had slammed into it. My wife started avoiding the basement altogether after she saw the odd marks on the floor down there. Scratches, deep ones, in uneven, frantic patterns. She said it was probably from furniture being dragged around, but her voice was shaky when she said it. The final straw came 2 months in, when I decided to rip up the carpet in the master bedroom. It was old, stained, and smelled faintly of mildew. Underneath, the floorboards were warped, discolored in wide patches. It was subtle but unmistakable. Water damage, maybe, or something else. That's when I saw the notch. A small, deliberate notch carved into one of the planks, like someone had pried it open before. My hands were shaking when I wedged it up with a flathead screwdriver. Beneath the floor was a cavity, not more than a foot deep, and inside there was a knife. Old, the blade tarnished, the wooden handle cracked and worn. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself it was just a tool someone had stashed and forgotten. But it wasn't like any tool I'd ever seen. My wife called from the hallway, asking if I needed help, and I slammed the floorboard back down before she could see. I didn't tell her about it. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to scare her. Maybe I didn't want to scare myself.